My husband threw my suitcase on the lawn and changed the locks while his girlfriend watched from our bedroom window. Neighbors filmed everything. I didn't cry. I called one number. A man showed up in 20 minutes. My husband came outside yelling. The man showed him papers. My husband's face went white. He looked at the house, then at me. It was a real story, one written in the gravel biting into my palms. Vanessa leaned against our headboard, sipping from my favorite mug. The suitcase had landed with a sickening, hollow thud. My mother's hand-stitched quilt spilled out, tangling with my nursing scrubs and winter boots. Derek stood on the porch, chest heaving, looking like a man who had finally won a war he started alone. He didn't even notice the red light of Mr. Kowalski's camera across the street. Behind him, the front door remained shut, a barrier of fresh oak and dead promises. I reached into my pocket, fingers finding the cold glass of my phone. Richard Brennan arrived in a silver sedan that smelled of old leather and expensive ink. He stepped onto the curb with a clinical precision that made the shouting stop instantly. Derek lunged forward, his finger stabbing the air as he demanded Richard leave his private property. The lawyer didn't flinch or raise his voice. He simply unclipped a heavy manila folder. The neighbors went silent, sensing the sudden shift in gravity. Richard held out a single, notarized page. Derek's hand shook as he took it. The document was a recorded deed dated 18 months ago. Richard's voice carried through the stagnant afternoon air like a bell. My mother had transferred sole ownership to me, while Derek was busy staying late for work meetings. He had lived here for 8 years, but he had never owned a single brick. The purple rage drained from his cheeks, leaving a waxen mask of pure terror. Behind him, Vanessa's smug smile vanished as she realized the bedroom window now belonged to the woman on the lawn. Richard pulled out a second sheet, his eyes fixed on Derek's sweating forehead. He detailed the home equity loans Derek had secured by forging my signature. The amount was staggering. A debt of $127,000. Derek stumbled backward, his heel catching on the threshold of a house that was now a legal cage. He looked at the neighbors, then at the manila folder. Every forged document was backed by a time-stamped photo from a hidden security camera. My mother had seen it all. A black pickup truck pulled into the driveway, blocking Derek's car. A man named Thomas stepped out, holding custody papers and a tired expression. He looked toward the bedroom window where Vanessa stood frozen. "I've been looking for my wife for 8 months," he said quietly. Vanessa's face cracked into 1,000 pieces as her secret life collided with the gravel. Derek turned to me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. I finally stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked inside. I walked past Derek, my shoulder brushing his rigid frame. He didn't move to stop me. The hallway felt smaller now, crowded with the ghosts of 1,000 quiet lies. Vanessa's floral perfume hung heavy in the air, clashing with the vanilla candles I always burned. I saw her shadow retreat toward the kitchen. She was moving fast, probably looking for her phone or a back exit. I didn't care about her yet. I needed the safe. The floorboards creaked under my boots, a familiar rhythm in an alien house. I reached the master bedroom and stopped. The blue robe lay crumpled on the carpet like a discarded skin. Vanessa stood by the nightstand, her fingers fumbling with a small, gold-plated jewelry box. It was my mother's. She looked up, her eyes darting between me and the hallway where Thomas was shouting. "I was just packing," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin, like breaking glass. I ignored her and knelt by the floor safe hidden under the rug. My fingers moved with mechanical precision, clicking through the combination. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing the organized stacks of my life. Derek hadn't managed to crack this. I pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. My name was written in my mother's elegant, steady hand. I felt the weight of her final secret resting against my palm. It felt warm. A sudden crash echoed from the kitchen. I turned to see Derek standing in the doorway, his face twisted with a desperate, animal fear. He saw the envelope and lunged forward. "That's mine," he hissed, his voice cracking. "She promised me part of the estate for taking care of her." I stood up slowly, clutching the paper to my chest. He looked pathetic, a small man drowning in a large lie. He didn't know Richard was right behind him. Richard's hand landed on Derek's shoulder like a lead weight. "Mr. Mitchell, you are currently in violation of a restraining order," he said. The lawyer's voice was a calm blade. Derek froze, his eyes fixed on the envelope. He knew whatever was inside would be his final undoing. Vanessa tried to slip past us, but Thomas was waiting in the hallway. He held up a digital tablet. "The bank records just cleared, Vanessa," Thomas said. "I know where you hid it." The room went cold as Vanessa's face drained of color. She looked at Derek, then at Thomas, then back at the jewelry box. The calculation was over. She had nowhere left to run. Derek let out a low, mourning sound and collapsed into the armchair. He looked at the walls he had tried to steal. They seemed to be leaning in, suffocating him. Richard gestured toward the door. "Time to go, Derek. Every second you stay adds a year to your sentence." I walked back to the kitchen and sat at the table. The neighbors were still watching through the window, their phones held high like torches. Derek was led out in handcuffs, his head bowed. Vanessa followed, flanked by Thomas and the silent, judging air of the cold, deep sack. I broke the red wax seal on the envelope. Inside sat a check and a final letter. My mother hadn't just saved the house. She had left me the names of his lenders. The kitchen light flickered, casting long shadows across the granite island. I stared at the list of lenders Richard had provided. These weren't standard banks. They were private firms with aggressive collection reputations. Derek had traded my peace for high, interest blood money. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The front door slammed, and Richard walked back inside, his expression unreadable. He tapped a new folder on the counter. "There is a second lien on this kitchen, Ava." My breath caught in my throat. This house was a fortress, yet Derek had bored holes through the walls. Richard sat down, his suit jacket straining against his shoulders. He explained that the forgery wasn't just about the loans. Derek had tried to sell the heir rights above the property to a developer. It was a desperate move to cover his gambling debts. I looked at the ceiling. The architecture felt heavy now. The betrayal had structural consequences. I reached for the cream envelope again, my fingers tracing the wax. My mother had anticipated the debt, but the heir rights were new. Richard leaned forward, his eyes sharp. He didn't just want the house. He wanted the land gone. I realized Derek never intended to stay here with Vanessa. He was liquidating my history for a quick exit. A low whistle sounded from the backyard. I stood up and walked to the sliding glass door. Two men in orange vests stood near the old oak tree. They carried surveying equipment and bright neon stakes. One of them began marking the soil near my mother's rose bushes. The developer wasn't waiting for the legal dust to settle. They thought the deal was closed. I stepped onto the patio, the cool air hitting my face. The power shift felt fragile. I had the deed, but they had a signed contract. Derek's greed had long legs. "Hey, get off my property," I shouted. The taller surveyor looked up, checking a digital tablet. He didn't look bothered. "We have a work order from Mitchell Holdings," he replied. Derek had formed a shell company to bypass my name. It was a clever layer of deception I hadn't expected. Richard joined me on the deck, his phone already pressed to his ear. He looked at the orange stakes and cursed softly. The fight was expanding into the dirt. Richard hung up and looked at me. The shell company is legally distinct from the marriage assets. We needed a court injunction by morning, or the trees would come down. I looked at the rose bushes, their thorns glinting in the moonlight. They were the last things my mother touched before she went into hospice. The pressure was moving from the past into the immediate present. I had to stop the machines. I didn't have much time left. I grabbed the surveyor's tablet and pointed to the primary deed. He laughed, a dry sound that grated on my nerves. Then he pointed to a clause at the bottom of his screen. It wasn't a sale of air rights. It was an easement for a massive drainage pipe. If they started digging, the foundation of the house would crack. I looked back at the kitchen where the list of lenders sat. There was one name missing from Richard's file. I stared at the empty space on the page where the lead creditor should be. The name missing from Richard's file was the local hospital's board chairman, a man who had smiled at me in the hallways for years. Derek had borrowed money from my own employers to fund his shell company. The surveyor moved his tripod closer to the rose bushes, oblivious to my internal collapse. If I didn't act now, the machines would tear into the property before dawn arrived. Richard rubbed his temples, his legal mind working through the labyrinthine layers of the Mitchell Holdings entity. He pulled a map from his briefcase, showing the proposed drainage path. It sliced directly through the master bedroom's foundation. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Derek hadn't just made a bad deal. He had signed a contract that ensured the house would eventually be condemned. He wanted the insurance payout, not the home. I walked back into the kitchen and grabbed my work badge from the counter. The plastic felt cold against my palm. I needed to confront the chairman before the surveyors broke ground. Richard grabbed my arm, his face etched with worry. "Iva, if you go there now, you risk your job." I didn't care about the career he had already compromised. I cared about the heritage Derek tried to bury. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel. I backed my car out of the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the orange stakes. The surveyors were already unloading heavy marking paint from their truck. I drove toward the hospital, my heart hammering against my ribs. The streets were empty, but the weight of my mother's letter felt like a passenger in the seat. She knew the chairman's wife. That was the leverage I needed tonight. The hospital lobby was quiet, smelling of floor wax and sterile silence. I bypassed the nursing station and headed straight for the administrative wing. My badge swiped green, granting me access to the executive offices. I found the chairman sitting at his desk, staring at a stack of blueprints that looked far too familiar. He looked up, his surprise quickly hardening into a mask of professional indifference. "Iva, you shouldn't be here after hours," he said coldly. I tossed the forged loan documents onto his desk. The paper landed with a sharp snap that echoed in the vaulted room. He didn't look at them. Instead, he looked at the security feed on his monitor. He was watching the surveyors in my backyard in real time. He was part of the shell company. The betrayal wasn't just marital. It was institutional. He leaned back, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Your husband made a very lucrative deal." I leaned over the desk, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. "My mother left me more than a house. She left me her diaries." The chairman's smile faltered for the first time. Eleanor had been the head nurse here for 30 years. She knew every secret buried in the billing department. I saw the flick of his eyes toward the shredder in the corner. He knew exactly which entries I was talking about. Then, the office phone began to ring. The chairman stared at the ringing phone, his fingers hovering over the receiver. I stood my ground, watching the sweat bead on his upper lip. He knew my mother's diaries weren't just sentimental memories. They were detailed accounts of every kickback, he had accepted over 2 decades. He finally answered, his voice trembling as he listened to the person on the other end. He looked at me with pure hatred before hanging up. "The police are at your house," he said. My heart plummeted into my stomach. I assumed Richard had called them to stop the surveyors. But the chairman's grimace suggested something worse. I didn't wait for an explanation. I ran out of the office, my nursing clogs squeaking on the sterile linoleum. I needed to get back to the property before Derek did something irreversible. As I reached my car, I saw a text from Richard. It was a photo of a backhoe arriving. The digging had already begun. I drove like a woman possessed, ignoring red lights and empty intersections. The night air screamed past my window. I pulled onto my street and saw the flashing blue lights of 3 squad cars. Neighbors stood on their lawns in pajamas, their faces illuminated by the strobing glare. The backhoe was idling near the rose bushes, its massive metal bucket dripping with fresh mud. Derek was being pressed against a cruiser, his wrists bound in silver. He looked broken. Richard met me at the edge of the driveway, his face pale in the moonlight. He tried to set fire to the garage, Iva, he whispered. Derek had realized the fraud charges were just the beginning. In his desperation to destroy the evidence of the shell company, he had nearly burned down the neighborhood. I looked at the garage where my mother's old gardening tools were kept. The smell of gasoline was thick. The betrayal had turned into a violent tantrum. One officer approached me, holding a charred ledger he had pulled from the backhoe's cab. It was a secondary set of books for Mitchell Holdings. Derek hadn't destroyed them. He had accidentally preserved them in his panic. The officer opened the cover, revealing a list of names that included half the town council. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. It was a criminal conspiracy centered on my foundation. The scale of the rot was finally visible to everyone. The surveyors were gone, their orange stakes trampled into the dirt. I walked over to the backhoe and touched the cold metal. It was a machine of progress used for destruction. Thomas, Vanessa's husband, was still there helping the police secure the perimeter. He looked at me with a sad, knowing nod. "She's gone, Ava." She took his car. Vanessa had managed to slip away during the chaos, leaving Derek to face the fire alone. She always escaped. I sat on my suitcase again, the one Derek had thrown earlier. The night was finally ending, but the silence felt heavy. Richard stood beside me, watching the tow truck haul away the backhoe. We had stopped the digging, but the ground was scarred. I looked up at the bedroom window. The light was still on, casting a lonely glow over the empty lawn. My house was safe, but the foundation was surrounded by evidence tape. Then, I heard a child cry. The cry was thin and sharp, cutting through the heavy scent of gasoline. I stood up, my joints popping in the pre-dawn chill. Thomas stood by his truck, his face pale as he looked at the back seat. I realized then that the children had seen everything. They saw their mother vanish and their father become a stranger in the dark. Thomas opened the door, and the boy tumbled out, trembling. He clutched a tattered teddy bear. The child looked at my scared lawn. I moved toward them, my nursing instincts overriding the exhaustion in my marrow. The boy's sister stayed in the shadows of the cab, her eyes wide. I knelt in the dirt, ignoring the dampness seeping into my scrubs. "You're safe now," I whispered, though the word felt like a lie. Thomas reached for my hand, his grip crushing. He was a man who had lost his compass. He didn't know how to explain this level of human ugliness to his own blood. Richard approached with a heavy sigh, his briefcase swinging at his side. He looked at the children, then at the charred remains of the garage. "The DA is coming," he said. The investigation was widening to include the town council members. Derek's fire had lit a beacon that the local authorities couldn't ignore. I saw a black SUV pull up behind the police cruisers. A woman in a sharp suit stepped out, carrying a digital recorder. She wasn't local. She was federal. The agent walked toward us, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't look at the fire damage. She looked at the backhoe. "Who authorized the easement?" she asked. Her voice was like iron hitting stone. Richard stepped forward, presenting the papers from the hospital chairman's office. The power balance shifted again. This wasn't just a divorce or a fraud case. It was a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act investigation. My house was the physical center of a massive state-wide criminal enterprise. The agent took the files, her eyes scanning the names Eleanor had recorded. She stopped at the chairman's signature. "We've been tracking this shell company for years," she admitted. "They just needed the physical evidence Derek tried to burn." I realized then why my mother had been so patient. She wasn't just protecting me. She was acting as an informant for the federal government during her final days. The $40,000 check wasn't just savings. It was a dangerous reward for her silence. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. My mother had carried this weight while she was dying in my arms. She had faced the chairman and Derek while I changed her IV bags. The courage it took to remain silent was unfathomable. Thomas shifted his weight, looking at the federal agent with a mix of fear and hope. "Will they find Vanessa?" he asked. The agent didn't look up from the folder. "We already have her," she said. The twist was a physical shock. Vanessa hadn't escaped the neighborhood. She had been intercepted 3 blocks away by a secondary team. She was currently sitting in an interrogation room at the substation. Thomas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. The children looked at the SUV, perhaps sensing their mother was inside a cage. I looked at the bedroom window one last time. The light was still on, but the room felt different. It was evidence now. Richard tapped my shoulder, gesturing toward the front door. "We need to secure the interior, Ava," he said. The feds were going to seize everything for a forensic audit. My home was becoming a crime scene. I felt a surge of panic. This was where my mother died. This was where my history lived. I couldn't let them take the books or the quilt. I stepped onto the porch, blocking the doorway. My stoic patience had reached its absolute limit. The federal agent stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at my work badge and the dirt on my knees. "We only need the office." "Iva Mitchell," she said calmly. She promised they wouldn't touch the rest of the house. I let out a breath I had been holding for hours. Richard stayed with them, acting as my shield. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. The cream envelope was still there. I opened it again. There was a final note tucked behind the check. It was a map of the floorboards in the library. My mother had hidden a second, digital drive under the mahogany planks. It contained the audio recordings of Derek and the chairman discussing the easement. The feds didn't have it yet. Neither did Richard. I realized then that I held the only key to their complete destruction. My mother hadn't just protected me. She had given me the power to choose their fate. I moved toward the library, my footsteps echoing on the cold hardwood. The federal agents were busy in the administrative wing, their voices a low hum of professional intrusion. I found the mahogany plank near the corner bookshelf, exactly where my mother's map indicated. My fingers pried back the wood with a sharp, dry snap. Beneath lay a small, black USB drive wrapped in velvet. It felt heavier than it looked. This was the final nail for Derek and his powerful, greedy friends. The back of my neck prickled with a sudden, localized heat. I turned to see the federal agent standing in the library doorway. She wasn't looking at the drive yet. She was looking at the gap in the floorboards. "We missed that during the sweep," she noted. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes were calculating. I gripped the drive tighter, the plastic edges biting into my palm. I had to decide if I trusted the system that let this rot grow. "This belonged to my mother?" I said, my voice steady. I didn't hand it over immediately. I needed to know if the council members would actually face a judge. The agent stepped into the room, her boots silent on the rug. She explained that the chairman was already naming names in exchange for a lighter sentence. Derek was the only one left without a deal, because he had tried to burn the evidence. He was the fall guy for the entire operation. I looked at the drive, then at the scarred lawn visible through the library window. The sun was finally rising, casting a pale, honest light over the wreckage. I realized that my mother didn't want revenge. She wanted the truth to be the foundation of my new life. I held out the drive. The agent took it with a nod of grim respect. "This changes the charges from fraud to racketeering," she said. Derek wouldn't be coming home for a very long time. Richard entered the room, his face illuminated by the morning glare. He looked older. The stress of the night etched into his skin. He told me that Thomas had taken the children to a local hotel. Vanessa was refusing to speak until she saw a lawyer. The neighborhood was finally beginning to breathe again. I felt a strange sense of emptiness. The battle was won, but the house felt like a stranger. It was a shell of its former self. I walked to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. The smell of roasted beans began to mask the lingering scent of gasoline. Richard sat at the island, watching me move with mechanical precision. He pushed a final document toward me. It was the insurance claim for the garage and the foundation damage. Derek's attempted arson had actually triggered a massive payout. The house would be rebuilt with better materials. My mother had even planned for the destruction of her own property. The realization made me laugh, a short, jagged sound. Eleanor Mitchell had played a game of chess against men who didn't even know they were on a board. She had used Derek's predictable greed to ensure my financial future. I looked at the check for $40,000 again. It wasn't just for me. It was seed money. I told Richard I wanted to start a foundation for women in crisis. He smiled, his eyes crinkling. "She knew you would say that." "Ava." We sat in silence for a while, watching the police tape flutter in the breeze. The investigators were packing up their gear, their task finished. The silver sedan pulled away, leaving the street to the quiet residents. I felt the weight of the last 3 months finally lift. I was no longer just a daughter or a betrayed wife. I was a woman with resources and a mission. I walked to the porch and looked at the rose bushes. They were crushed. I knelt in the dirt and began pulling the neon stakes from the ground. Each one I removed felt like a thorn being pulled from my heart. The surveyors were gone, and the machines were silent. I would replant the garden in the spring. I would use the insurance money to fix the cracked foundation. The house would stand. It was a witness to loyalty and a monument to a mother's love. My hands were covered in mud and glory. The morning mail carrier arrived, sliding a single envelope into the box. It was a postcard from Ohio with no return address. I opened it and saw a picture of a quiet park. On the back, a single sentence was written in a cramped, hurried hand. "Tell Thomas I am sorry." I stared at the words until they blurred. Vanessa was still playing the victim, even from behind bars. I tore the card into tiny pieces and let them fall. The sun climbed higher, exposing the true depth of the damage. My garage was a blackened skeleton, and the yard looked like a battlefield. I walked back into the kitchen, my boots leaving mud tracks on the tile. The cream envelope sat by my cold coffee. I pulled out the check for $40,000 and stared at it. This was my mother's final sacrifice for my freedom. She had suffered through pain to ensure I would never be small again. The front door opened, and Richard walked in with a wary smile. He held a legal document with a heavy state seal. "The restraining order is permanent, Ava," he said. Derek would never set foot on this street again. He was facing 15 years for the racketeering charges and arson. The chairman had already signed a full confession. Everything was finally falling into place. I looked at the quilt on the chair and felt a sudden, deep sense of belonging. I told Richard about the Second Chapter Society. I wanted to turn this house into a sanctuary for women like me. He nodded, already pulling out a fresh notepad to draft the bylaws. We would use the insurance payout to fix the foundation and the garage. The money would provide legal aid for those who had nothing left. It was a mission born from wreckage. I finally understood why my mother kept the deed. She saw this future coming. A year later, the house looked different. The scars in the yard were gone, replaced by a thriving garden of white roses.